to Valkyrie. The 4-star general raised his crystal glass high above the crowd. The ballroom fell silent. Then he smiled and added words that made my husband nearly choke on his bourbon. She saved every career in this room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then more than 200 military leaders, Pentagon officials, retired generals, and defense executives rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. I could hear glasses clinking, chairs scraping against polished floors, people turning toward me. People who knew exactly who I was. Across the table, my husband Richard coughed violently into his napkin. His face had gone completely pale. A few minutes earlier, he had leaned close enough for only me to hear him. "Try not to embarrass me. These people are way out of your league." I remembered every word, every single one. And as the applause continued around us, I wondered if he remembered them too. But before I tell you what happened that night, you need to understand how we got there. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old. I spent 31 years in the United States Army. Most of that time was in military intelligence. For obvious reasons, there are still things I cannot discuss. There are operations that remain classified. People whose names I will never speak publicly. Decisions that changed lives and careers. But this story isn't really about military secrets. It's about something much more common. Something that happens inside thousands of American homes every day. It's about being invisible, especially to the person who should see you most. Richard and I had been married for 35 years. We met when we were young. Before promotions. Before children. Before mortgages and retirement accounts. Before life became complicated. Back then, he admired my ambition. He used to tell people how proud he was that I served. He attended ceremonies, pinned medals on my uniform, wrote letters when I was deployed. For a long time, we were partners. At least that's what I believed. Somewhere along the way, things changed. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like paint fading from a wall. After retiring from the Army, Richard built a successful career in defense consulting. He was good at it. Smart. Charismatic. People liked him. Over time, he became known in Washington circles. Invitations started arriving. Networking events. Charity galas. Fundraisers. Military appreciation dinners. Every year, his reputation grew. And every year, my accomplishments seemed to shrink in his eyes. At first, it was little things. Someone would ask what I used to do. Before I could answer, Richard would say, "Oh, she worked for the government." Worked for the government. 31 years reduced to 5 words. I'd smile politely and let it go. Then it became jokes. "Don't ask Evelyn about her career. She'll have to kill us." People laughed. I laughed too. But after hearing the same joke 100 times, it stopped being funny. One evening at a dinner party, a retired colonel asked where I had served. Before I could answer, Richard interrupted. "Trust me, nothing exciting." The colonel looked surprised. I felt something inside me crack. Just a little. Nothing exciting. I had spent years away from my family. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings. Watched my children grow up through photographs during deployments. Nothing exciting. I never argued. Never corrected him. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But every small dismissal added up. Like drops of water wearing away stone. Then came the invitation. The annual Defense Leadership Gala. One of the most prestigious military events in the region. Retired generals, active duty leaders, senior Pentagon officials. The kind of gathering where everyone wore their best uniforms and polished shoes. When the invitation arrived, Richard seemed unusually excited. "We should go," he said. "You mean you should go?" I replied. "No," he said casually. "You can come with me. You can come with me. Not we'd go together. Not we'd attend. You can come with me." Like I was an accessory. Like a handbag. Or a +1. I looked at him carefully. He didn't even realize what he'd said. That hurt most of all. The week before the gala, I considered staying home. I truly did. But something inside me changed. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. I was tired. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of proving myself. Tired of reminding people who I was. Especially my own husband. So I made a decision. I would attend the gala. I would wear my dress. I would smile. And for once I would stop correcting anyone. If people knew who I was, fine. If they didn't, that was fine too. I wasn't going there to impress anyone. I certainly wasn't going there to defend my worth. The night of the event arrived. Richard adjusted his tuxedo in the mirror. I stood beside him in my evening gown. He barely glanced at me. Then, as we entered the ballroom filled with military leaders and decorated veterans, he leaned toward me and whispered words I will never forget. Try not to embarrass me. These people are way out of your league. I looked at him. Then I smiled. And said absolutely nothing. Because 20 minutes later, the entire room would learn something my husband had forgotten years ago. So would he. The ballroom sparkled beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Military uniforms filled the room. Rows of medals reflected the golden light. Conversations drifted through the air alongside the sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz. I followed Richard through the crowd. Or perhaps I should say I followed behind him. Because that's what it felt like. Everywhere we went, people greeted him. Defense contractors. Former officers. Government officials. Richard was in his element. He shook hands. Told stories. Accepted compliments. Introduced himself over and over. And every time someone glanced toward me, the same pattern repeated. This is my wife Evelyn. Nothing more. No mention of my service. No mention of my rank. No mention of the 3 decades I spent wearing a uniform. Just Evelyn. At one point, a retired Navy admiral asked how we met. Richard launched into a story before I could answer. Everyone laughed. The admiral nodded politely. Then he turned toward me. So what line of work were you in? I opened my mouth. Richard beat me to it. Government work. The admiral smiled. That's a broad category. Richard laughed. Trust me, she prefers not talking about it. The group chuckled. I smiled politely. The same smile I had perfected over the years. The smile women use when correcting someone would only make things worse. But inside something ached. Not because strangers didn't know my story. Because my husband did. And acted as if it didn't matter. I excused myself and wandered toward the edge of the ballroom. A waiter passed carrying champagne. I took a glass and found a quiet corner near one of the tall windows. Outside, the lights of Washington shimmered against the dark sky. For a few moments I simply stood there, watching, thinking, remembering. There was a reason I rarely talked about my career. Most people assume secrecy is exciting. In reality, it can be lonely. Many of the most important things I did could never be discussed at dinner tables. There would be no books, no interviews, no public recognition. That was part of the job. Years earlier, long before retirement, I had been assigned to a small intelligence task force. A crisis had emerged overseas. The details still remain classified. What I can say is this. Several senior military leaders made decisions based on faulty intelligence. Very faulty intelligence. If those decisions had moved forward, careers would have been destroyed. Promotions revoked. Reputations ruined. Perhaps worse. A small team of us worked around the clock to uncover what had gone wrong. Weeks turned into months. Sleep became a luxury. Families became distant voices on the phone. Eventually, we found the truth. More importantly, we proved it. The correction prevented a disaster. The people whose careers had been hanging by a thread never forgot. Most of them never publicly discussed it. Neither did I. That was how military professionals operated. You did your job. Then you moved on. The mission mattered more than recognition. At least that's what I believed. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Across the room, Richard was holding court again. People surrounded him. He looked happy, confident, important. I watched him for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. A man stopped walking. Completely stopped. He was perhaps 70 years old. Tall, straight-backed, wearing the posture that never truly leaves career military officers. His eyes locked onto mine. At first I didn't recognize him. Then he smiled. And suddenly I did. General Thomas Grayson. Retired now. But once one of the most respected officers in the Pentagon. For a brief second he looked stunned. Then he crossed the ballroom directly toward me. Not toward Richard. Toward me. Evelyn Carter. I laughed softly. It's been a while, General. A while, he said. Good Lord. He shook his head. I haven't seen you in nearly 15 years. We spoke for several minutes, mostly about family, retirement, grandchildren, the things older people talk about when they've already spent decades proving themselves. But there was something in his eyes. Respect. Genuine respect. The kind that cannot be manufactured. The kind earned over years. Eventually another retired officer joined us. Then another. Suddenly I found myself surrounded by people I hadn't seen in decades. People who remembered. People who knew. Across the ballroom I noticed Richard watching. His expression looked puzzled. Not worried. Not threatened. Just confused. As though he couldn't understand why senior officers kept approaching me. At one point he even walked over. General Grayson greeted him warmly. Richard. Then he turned back toward me, and continued our conversation. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, my husband had assumed my military career was a footnote. Yet some of the most accomplished people in the room clearly felt otherwise. Still, Richard didn't seem concerned. If anything, he looked amused, as though this was merely nostalgia among retirees, as though none of it meant very much. I almost felt sorry for him, because he had no idea what was coming. A few minutes later, a bell rang softly through the ballroom. Guests began returning to their tables. The evening program was about to begin. People took their seats. The chairman stepped toward the podium. Richard relaxed beside me. The room gradually fell silent. Then the chairman smiled, and said words that made several people around me sit up straighter. "Before we continue, there's someone special we'd like to recognize tonight." My stomach tightened. Across the room, General Grayson slowly turned toward me and smiled. The ballroom fell silent. More than 200 people sat facing the stage. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. The chairman adjusted the microphone and smiled. "Before we continue with tonight's program," he said, "there's someone in this room we need to recognize." A few guests exchanged curious looks. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because I didn't know what was happening, because I did. General Grayson glanced toward me from across the room. His expression told me everything. Someone had planned this, probably months ago, and somehow nobody had warned me. The chairman continued. "Many years ago, a crisis threatened careers, missions, and the reputation of several leaders sitting in this very room." The audience listened carefully. Richard sat beside me sipping his bourbon. Still relaxed, still unaware. The chairman nodded toward the front table. General Matthews, a 4-star general, stood. Even after retirement, he carried himself with unmistakable authority. The room immediately straightened. Some habits never disappear around a 4-star. General Matthews accepted the microphone. He looked around the ballroom slowly. Then he raised his glass. "To Valkyrie." For a second, nobody moved. Then dozens of faces broke into smiles. People knew that name. Not everyone, but enough. The applause started near the front of the room, then spread like wildfire. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted. People stood. Chairs scraped across the floor. Hands clapped. Some guests even whistled. I lowered my eyes briefly. Embarrassed, grateful, overwhelmed. Beside me, Richard froze. I could practically feel the confusion radiating from him. He looked around the room, then at me, then back toward the stage. General Matthews waited until the applause settled. Then he smiled. "Most of you know the story." Several people laughed softly. He pointed toward me. "Though she would never tell it herself." More laughter. That part was true. "I never had," General Matthews continued. 20 years ago, a small intelligence team discovered information that prevented one of the biggest professional disasters many of us would ever face. The room grew quieter. Nobody was looking at him anymore. They were looking at me. Richard slowly lowered his glass. I stared at the tablecloth, wishing I could disappear. But the general wasn't finished. "There are officers in this room who made mistakes." A few people chuckled nervously. "There are officers in this room who received bad information." More nods. "There are officers in this room who would have lost everything if that information hadn't been corrected." The room became completely silent. Then the general lifted his glass again and said the sentence that changed everything. "She saved every career in this room." No applause this time. Just stunned silence, followed by something even more powerful. People stood again. Every single person. A standing ovation. Longer than the first one. Stronger. Louder. The chairman was clapping. Retired generals were clapping. Pentagon officials were clapping. People who had spent entire careers earning respect were standing for me. Across the ballroom, I noticed tears in one woman's eyes. Another retired officer nodded toward me with quiet gratitude. And beside me, Richard choked on his drink. Actually choked. He coughed so hard he had to grab a napkin. His face turned bright red, then pale, then red again. I almost felt guilty. Almost. General Matthews waited patiently. Then he added one final thought. "The remarkable thing isn't what she did." The room quieted again. "It's that she never asked for recognition afterward." His eyes met mine. She simply went back to work. For some reason, those words hit harder than everything else. Because they were true. I hadn't wanted awards, or speeches, or applause. I had simply done my job, the way thousands of military men and women do every day. General Matthews stepped away from the podium. The chairman returned. But before he could continue, another guest stood. Then another. Then another. People began walking toward my table, one by one. A retired admiral shook my hand. "Good to see you again, Colonel." A former Pentagon director smiled. "I've wanted to thank you for years." Another officer laughed. "My promotion would have disappeared without you." Each interaction seemed to make Richard smaller, quieter, more uncomfortable. For years he had introduced me as someone who worked for the government. Now some of the most accomplished people in the country were lining up to speak with me. Not him. Me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Eventually, General Grayson reached our table. He shook my hand warmly. Then he looked directly at Richard. For a moment I thought he might say something diplomatic, something polite. Instead he frowned slightly. "Richard," he said. "Yes." The general smiled. "You never told us she was your wife." The words landed like a hammer. A few people nearby laughed. Not cruelly, just honestly surprised. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he genuinely had no idea what to say. General Grayson patted him on the shoulder, then turned back toward me. "The chairman would like you at the front table." I blinked. "What?" "Come on, Colonel." He smiled. "They've been waiting all evening." As I stood from my chair, I looked at Richard. He stared back at me, not angry, not embarrassed, not even defensive. For the first time in years, he looked like a man realizing how little he truly knew about the person sitting beside him. And somehow that hurt more than all the dismissive comments ever had. The drive home was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes after a pleasant evening. Not the peaceful silence of two people who know each other well. This silence had weight. The kind that sits between two people and refuses to move. Richard drove. I stared out the passenger window. The lights of Washington blurred past in the darkness. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Evelyn." I kept my eyes on the window. "Yes, I didn't know." The words hung in the air. Simple, honest, and somehow completely inadequate. I turned toward him. "You didn't know what—" He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Any of it." For a moment I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was astonishing. After 35 years of marriage, my husband was finally admitting he didn't know who I was. The realization seemed to hurt him as much as it hurt me. "You never asked," I said quietly. Richard flinched. The truth often does that. For the rest of the drive, neither of us spoke. When we reached home, I kicked off my shoes and headed toward the kitchen. The house felt strangely different, as though something had shifted, as though a curtain had finally been pulled back. Richard followed me inside. Neither of us changed clothes. Neither of us went to bed. Instead, we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays, paid bills, helped our children with homework, discussed retirement plans. Tonight it felt like unfamiliar territory. Richard stared at his hands. Then he finally said it. "I'm sorry." I nodded politely, but I didn't respond. Because apologies are easy. Understanding is harder. After several seconds, he looked up. "What happened to us?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked it. Because he genuinely seemed confused. As though the answer had appeared out of nowhere. As though tonight had caused the problem instead of revealing it. I folded my hands together. "What happened is that you stopped seeing me." His eyes widened slightly. I continued. "You didn't stop loving me." His shoulders relaxed. Then I added, "But you stopped seeing me." The relief vanished. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, I spoke again. "Do you know what hurt most tonight?" The things I said? No. The comments over the years? No. Richard looked confused. I leaned back in my chair. What hurt most was realizing that complete strangers knew more about my career than my husband. The words landed heavily, because they were true. Richard lowered his eyes. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned away years ago. What remained was disappointment. A quieter emotion. A heavier one. I told him about the dinner parties. The introductions, the jokes, the interruptions, the countless times someone had asked me a question and Richard had answered for me. I wasn't accusing him. I was simply describing reality. By the time I finished, his face looked exhausted. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know." That was the tragedy. I truly did know. Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't malicious. The damage came from something else. Neglect. Assumption. Complacency. The belief that after decades together, there was nothing left to learn about the person beside you. The next morning I expected things to return to normal. Instead, the phone started ringing. At 9 o'clock, General Grayson called. At 10:30, another retired officer called. Then another. Then another. Each conversation was warm, friendly, filled with memories, stories, respect. Richard heard every single one. Around lunchtime, I walked into the living room and found him sitting quietly in his chair. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. He was thinking, deeply. The phone rang again. This time it was a retired 3-star general. The conversation lasted nearly half an hour. When I hung up, Richard spoke without looking at me. What did he want? To say hello. Richard nodded. A few moments passed. Then he asked a question I had waited years to hear. What exactly did you do? Not sarcastically. Not dismissively. Not as a joke. Genuinely. Honestly. Curiously, I stared at him. For a second I couldn't speak, because after all these years he was finally asking. That afternoon we sat together for hours, and for the first time in decades I told him stories, not classified information, not secrets, just stories. The human side of service, the sacrifices, the responsibility, the loneliness, the pressure, the victories, the failures, the moments that shaped me. Richard listened, really listened. No interruptions, no jokes, no checking his phone, no changing the subject, just listening. At one point his eyes filled with tears. I had no idea. I believed him. Because if he had understood, he never would have spoken to me the way he had. The sun was beginning to set when he finally looked at me. Not through me. At me? Evelyn. Yes. He swallowed hard, then asked quietly, "Can you give me one more chance to get this right?" For the first time in a very long time, I saw not the confident defense consultant, not the man who loved attention, not the husband who took me for granted. I saw the young man I married 35 years ago, and I realized he was finally ready to learn who his wife really was. Change did not happen overnight. Life rarely works that way. There was no dramatic speech, no grand romantic gesture, no surprise vacation, no miracle moment that erased years of hurt. Instead, there were small things. Simple things. The kinds of things that seem insignificant until you've lived without them. A week after the gala, Richard asked if I wanted to have breakfast together. Just breakfast. No agenda. No distractions. During the meal, he asked questions. Real questions. Not the polite kind people ask while waiting for their turn to speak. The kind asked by someone who genuinely wants to understand. What was your hardest deployment? What did you miss most while you were away? Were you ever scared? Sometimes I answered immediately. Sometimes I needed a moment. Not because the memories were classified. Because they were personal. For years I had stopped expecting anyone to ask. Especially him. Now he listened to every answer. The more we talked, the more I realized something surprising. Richard wasn't discovering a new version of me. He was discovering the version that had always existed. The version he had slowly stopped noticing. One afternoon we were sorting through old boxes in the attic. Boxes neither of us had opened in years. Inside were photographs, army ceremonies, family holidays, promotion celebrations, pictures of our children when they were small. At one point, Richard found a photograph taken shortly after my promotion to colonel. I remembered the day immediately. The pride, the responsibility, the excitement. Richard stared at the picture for a long time. Then he shook his head. "I can't believe I forgot what this meant to you." I looked at the photograph. Then at him. "You didn't forget." He looked confused. "You just stopped paying attention." The old Richard might have become defensive. The new Richard simply nodded, because he knew I was right. That honesty became the foundation of everything that followed. Weeks turned into months. Gradually our conversations deepened, not only about my experiences, about his as well. For the first time in years we talked about fears, regrets, aging, retirement, the uncertainty that comes with growing older. The truth was that Richard had spent years chasing importance, building a reputation, collecting recognition, seeking validation. Somewhere along the way he had started measuring value by visibility. If something wasn't public, it seemed less significant. The gala changed that, because he finally saw something he should have understood long ago. Some of the most important contributions happen quietly, without applause, without headlines, without anyone knowing, including the people closest to us. One evening, several months after the gala, we attended a local veterans appreciation event. Nothing fancy, just a community gathering. Folding chairs, coffee, patriotic decorations, veterans from different generations sharing stories. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, the kind of event I always enjoyed. As Richard and I walked through the room, a woman approached us. She looked to be in her 70s. Kind eyes, gentle smile. She extended her hand toward me. "Thank you for your service." I smiled. "Thank you." Then she asked the question I had heard countless times throughout my life. "What branch did you serve in?" Before I could answer, Richard spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just naturally. "Army," the woman smiled. Richard continued. "My wife served for 31 years. The woman looked impressed. But Richard wasn't finished. A warm smile crossed his face. "You should hear what she accomplished." I looked at him. For a moment the room seemed to disappear. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. There was no performance. No attempt to impress anyone. No desire to borrow my accomplishments. Only pride. Respect. Admiration. The things I had been missing for years. The woman listened as Richard spoke about my service. About sacrifice. About commitment. About character. When he finished, she shook my hand again. Then she thanked both of us. As she walked away, Richard looked at me. "I finally understand something." "What?" He smiled softly. "The most remarkable person in my life was sitting right beside me the whole time." I laughed. "You took your time figuring that out." "Yeah," he admitted. "I did." We stood there together, older now. Wiser, hopefully. Certainly more honest. The gala had not saved our marriage. The truth had. The willingness to listen had. The courage to admit mistakes had. And the decision to truly see each other again had. Before this story ends, I'd like to leave you with one thought. Sometimes the people we love carry burdens, accomplishments, sacrifices, and stories we barely notice, not because they're hiding them, because we've stopped looking. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a spouse, a parent, a veteran, a friend, take a moment to ask about their story. You may discover something extraordinary. And if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need the reminder. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories about resilient second chances and the quiet heroes among us. Because respect should never begin after public recognition. It should begin at home. The end.